Hello, everyone. How are we all doing this morning? Very good. We liked our first speaker. That's wonderful. My name is Heather Erlin, and I'm the Alberta representative for the Canadian Labour Congress. It's really an honor to be here today to learn with our speakers and then to also have the discussion later on today. So it's really a pleasure to introduce our two speakers that we have on the economy. And just to do a little bit of housekeeping, the question period and discussion period will be at the end. So please do save your thoughts and your notes for that. I will be looking across the room to get as much of a diversified response as I can. So even if you're the first person to put their hand up, doesn't mean that you'll be the first person to speak. I'm going to try to get as much equality and diversity in our responses and keep the conversation going. But don't let that keep you from keeping your hand up, because we do want to hear from everyone. And on that note, just to try to keep your comments brief, I do recognize that everyone here has a very important story to tell, and that's why we've allowed for time this evening and over lunch to chat with either the speakers or with each other about that story. But if your response or your question goes into a very detailed, lengthy question, I'll have to ask you to kind of summarize it and keep the ball moving. So thank you for your cooperation with that. So our first speaker today is Angella MacEwen. Had the pleasure of working her with the CLC, and we're very happy to have her here with CUPE now, here in Alberta. So she's going to be speaking to us today. She says that Alberta's strong economy has relied heavily on natural resources, but falling oil prices and the need to transition to low-carbon economy present opportunity to build a different type of economy. Looking at the fundamentals of Alberta's economy in a national and global context, how well prepared are we for this coming change? How has Alberta been a national and international leader on just transition, and what is the government's role as we continue to navigate the changing global context? And a little bit about Angella. Angella MacEwen is a labour economist with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Her primary focus is understanding the impacts of Canadian economic and social policy on workers, especially climate policy and international trade, as well as investment treaties. Before taking her current role in CUPE, she represented the Canadian Labour Congress as in a parliamentary committee and in national media. And Angella holds an MA in economics and a BA in international development studies. Please help me in welcoming Angella MacEwen.
Thank you. It's great to be here in Edmonton. How am I gonna the keyboard? Okay, that's great. So I'm not sure how much of what I'm going to say is going to be news for you, but I'm kind of just going to go over the context of the Alberta economy over the past few years and compare it to what am I doing? Okay, compare it to maybe the rest of Canada, what's going on, and what has the Alberta NDP's response been, and what do we think the role of government is right now, given this context, and what kind of possibilities are there for the future? And this is one of my favorite quotes: "The economy is too important to be left to economists." And it's true. The economy is often presented in the national media as something that is very technical, very abstract, too difficult for regular people to understand. But a lot of what I do is training with workers on the political economy and helping people understand that they are the economy. The things that we do every day, that's what the economy is. And so, and the point of an economy and growing the economy is to increase the well-being and happiness of the people in Canada. So what happened a few years ago in Alberta was pretty stark. The rest of the world was just recovering kind of very slowly from the 2008 financial crisis that Lynn covered so well last night for those of you that were here. And it was really stark. And even though oil and gas is a tiny, small percentage of employment in Alberta, the spin-offs are huge. When we face this huge fall in prices, what we saw was a fall in investment, a fall in manufacturing, a fall in infrastructure investment, and so it has much broader impacts than you might think if you only looked at the direct jobs. And this is just to show you two things, and this is the story of Alberta after the oil crash, is that investment declined dramatically in Alberta, but it's already so much higher than the average for the rest of Canada. So there's this kind of dual problem here, and you'll find me sometimes being sympathetic with Alberta and sometimes not being sympathetic, because there's so much wealth here that even when you face such a catastrophic blow to the economy, you're still better off than the rest of Canada. But budgets matter, and government actually relied on a lot of that non-resource revenue. The numbers aren't showing up properly here, I'm sorry, but it went from, in 2014-15, about $9 billion of revenue from non-renewable resources to less than $3 billion in the following year. So that's a gigantic drop in revenue for a relatively small province, right? And so what was the Alberta NDP response? It's kind of what we would have wanted it to be, maybe not as bold as we would have wanted it to be, but definitely in the right direction. They didn't cut public services. They went to work right away, implementing a carbon tax and a climate action plan. They raised minimum wages and labor legislation, and they're continuing to do so. The problem here is, of course, that Alberta was so far behind other provinces. Alberta in 2017 introduced, I think 5 days of unpaid sick leave and 3 days of unpaid bereavement leave, which is what Ontario is getting now after Doug Ford's rolling back the paid personal emergency leaves that we had in it. So Alberta now, improving, is the same as Ontario rolling back. And they funded some of the revenue shortfall with increases in corporate and personal income tax. They lowered small business tax rates, but mostly they borrowed. And last night when Lynn said they raised taxes on the wealthy, I heard the audience disagreeing. So I just wanted to say they did. You might forget it, maybe. But yeah, they went from the 10% flat tax to a more progressive tax rate. This doesn't raise nearly enough money to cover spending requirements, but it was definitely, again, a step in the right direction. Even with that, this is what we get. So this is from 1990 onward. It's current dollars, so it's not adjusted for inflation. What we see is generally expenditures rising and revenue rising until the crash. And right there at the end, you can see that little tick upward in 2017, 2018. Revenues from non-renewable resources picked up a little bit. It was stronger. The price of oil was stronger than expected. You've probably heard now that's weaker again. So this is the perennial hope in Alberta. Oh, the money's going to come back. It's probably not. But despite that dip in revenue, they maintained the level of infrastructure investment. Maintained. They didn't drop as much as you might have thought it would. The need is definitely there because there had been lots of growth, population growth. There was need for new schools. There was need for new recreation. Need was there. They're not meeting the need, but they're still kind of around the Canadian average. And in terms of what we spend on ourselves in Alberta, it's not the most in Canada, but it's more than Ontario. It's more than BC, for sure. It's a little bit less than Saskatchewan, but it's not wildly out of what you would think you should be spending on people in context with other provinces, and it's not low. So it's obvious to me and to many others when you look at all of this in context, this is that previous graph before, it's just the end of it, is that what we have in Alberta is a revenue problem. That you can't rely on volatile, non-renewable energy resources. And this is free of the climate change context, right? So I'm going into just the economic context, and then I'll talk about climate change a little bit after. And when you break down the sources of revenue compared to, say, Saskatchewan, it becomes a little bit clearer that we need to tax more. Basically, if you look at the tools available to government, you either need to increase personal income taxes on the wealthy, to increase corporate taxes, to introduce a sales tax, something. You need some kind of progressive taxation to fill this gap. And the other thing is that Alberta relies heavily on regressive, much too heavily compared to other provinces, this other own source revenue. A lot of that is fees and user fees and licensing and that kind of thing, which is quite regressive. And so we would need to switch, ideally, if I were doing this, if I were talking to Joe CC and I was saying, here's what you should do for the next budget, Joe. Like, he's never going to listen to me, but okay, here's what you should do for the next budget, Joe. You need to increase personal income taxes, you need to increase corporate taxes, and you need to get rid of some of these user fees. But again, Alberta's really wealthy. Even when you're suffering, the per capita GDP is high. It's consistently, over this period from the 2008 financial crisis through the oil shock, it's higher than the rest of Canada. And it's markedly higher than, say, New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, who honestly, will say to Albertans, okay, where were you when the cod fishery collapsed, right? We've been through this and we didn't get a just transition. And you have so much money. Why would I help pay for your just transition? So this is just that graph. And it's a question that is that money within Alberta being fairly distributed. It's not. So it's not like every Albertan has that much money. So it's certainly not that it's fair, but it is that the province produces a lot of wealth that we could share differently. So now we come to the climate crisis. This is an example. This is a chart that my friend Marnie Girard from the Green Economy Network produced. And this is what our GHG emissions are projected to be if we didn't have anything in place with the climate policies that we do have in place, with the ones that Trudeau is talking about, like the carbon tax backstop and the investment in renewables and what the Alberta government is doing on that sector. So that's the purple, is kind of what we've talked about. And you'll notice that even the purple, which is dramatically less than the current policies, we're missing our targets. And you might have also read recently or heard last night about the International Panel on Climate Change, saying that we have the next 10 years, 12 years, to take drastic action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, or the costs will be astronomical. And that is both financial costs and human costs. And I think Lynn covered that really well. There's the cost of migration. So what's happening in Honduras right now is an excellent example, Central America. The forest fires in California are directly linked to climate change. Even if you just look at warming, California's climate has warmed 3 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that pulls oxygen, or that pulls water out of the trees that makes them drier and more susceptible to the fires. And then when you think about the fires, it's really interesting. This is how neoliberalism then interacts with climate change. Kim Kardashian, it was in the news, Kim Kardashian and her husband Kanye West hired some private firefighters to protect their house from the fire. They were fine. And their neighbors, who are probably also quite wealthy, were like, oh goodness, thank you, Kim. This is amazing. You saved our house. Whereas other parts, lower income parts of the neighborhoods were completely demolished. People died. Kids, their migrant farm workers are working in fields where it's you shouldn't be allowed to. You can't breathe the air, and they're still out there working in fields. So when we have this context and we have to take this action, it just becomes obviously clear that the current path, that incremental policies, that a $20 carbon tax isn't going to get us there. And the reason that Alberta is so important, and the reason that Trudeau bought the pipeline, is because Canada can't get there without Alberta. We simply can't. If you look at where greenhouse gas emissions are produced in Canada, it's in Alberta. And if you're looking at what the trends have been since 2005, other provinces were making progress. Ontario weaned itself off coal. The recession helped other people. Manitoba and Quebec are incredibly lucky to have hydro as their source of electricity, which makes a big difference. That natural resource that they have just happens to be carbon neutral, which isn't fair, maybe. But this is coal generation, and this is why one of the first things that the Notley government talked about doing was transitioning off of coal. And it's absolutely necessary. But they're transitioning to natural gas. I was, my second day on the job at CUPE, I went and I presented to the Federal Finance Committee, which is fine because I did that for CLC too. But it's kind of dramatic to say. I did it on my second day on the job. And next to me was the lobbyist from the natural gas sector. And he made me feel really like about transitioning to natural gas. He wanted to get rid of all methane regulations. He wanted to get rid of, he's like, what we need to do to encourage investment in Canada is this. And so I think we need to be really careful about whether or not that's actually clean. And obviously there's other implications in BC where are we respecting, again, it's just like building a pipeline. Are we respecting the rights of First Nations people when we're extracting this wealth from their communities? So we have to get off coal. And one thing that the Alberta government did is they started to have this conversation with Albertans because Alberta relies so heavily on resource revenue, and because we emit so much here, people are very resistant to changing this. They don't, there's a lot of uncertainty. What is this going to mean for me? What is this going to mean for my family? Are we going to have to move? Is our house going to be worth nothing? Where can I get a job? Because there's no magic wand that turns coal miners or coal plant workers into computer programmers, right? AI is not the answer. I know Trudeau is investing in AI and he's got all these superclusters. He's like, yeah, that's it. No, it's not. But they started to have the conversation, and they went around to communities, and they offered communities, they extended EI, which is not enough, but it's something. They gave communities, they sat with them and they talked to them, and they helped them walk them through it, walk them through basically the grieving process. So that this past summer, when the federal government had their they had a just transition panel on climate change that is also just restricted to coal because they don't really want to talk about the bigger question. They're like, okay, we're just going to talk about something really specific that we can dig our teeth into. And they came, and my friend Tara Peel was on this panel for workers. And she said when they went through Alberta, you could tell that it was better because Alberta had already done so much of this work. They could see what some of the possibilities were, how they could, in Hanna, Alberta, they're looking at some creative ways to replace the industries that they've had to try to build new industries. It's not obvious what the answer is, but they're working on it. And they're still mad. They'll still probably vote for Jason Kenney. But they know that the Notley government has made an effort and that they've benefited from that. And they're more resigned to accepting that this change is inevitable. Whereas when they went to Saskatchewan to have the conversation with coal workers in Saskatchewan, they were having none of it. It's not a thing that we need to do. It's not a thing that's inevitable. This is Justin Trudeau and his fancy socks trying to take away my family's livelihood. And he has no idea what it's like for us. That's what it's like in Saskatchewan. So the work on the ground that the Notley government has done has prepared the transition emotionally for people who've been involved in that. So what is a just transition? A lot of people talk about it. This is a great paper from the CCPA. I recommend people go and look at that. It's not a thing that we've really done well, ever. I was talking to Ken Newman from the United Steelworkers. We were at the World Social Forum and we were talking about just transition. And he said the best example he could kind of think of was Uranium City, when the mine went and the government bought people's houses at market value and moved them somewhere else. And that's a good scenario. At least you don't lose your house. And just again, here's why it matters in Ontario. I know that you'll hear environmentalists say it's only 1% of employment in Canada, and it's not that much. But here is where that 1% of employment is. 138,000 of those 200,000 jobs are in Alberta. In Fort McMurray, it's 1 in 3 workers that are directly employed by oil and gas. In Hanna, it's like half. And sometimes those people are working at the coal plant and farming, right? So they're using their income from the coal plant to pay off the family farm. So it's not like they could move somewhere else and work somewhere else because they've still got the farm, right? So the fact that it's geographically concentrated and so much in Alberta for both direct jobs and for GDP. So 60%, almost 70% of the GDP that Canada generates from oil and gas is in Alberta, which is why you're so wealthy, right? It's why the province is so wealthy. It's why taxes are so low. But it's why it's going to be so hard to change. So I got a little bit ahead of myself with the just transition. So these are what Hadrian identifies as some of the aspects of a just transition. So we need to have a national economic strategy. We need to have, and this is kind of, economists in Canada don't like this word, but like we need an industrial strategy. We need to figure out what industries are we going to invest in, what infrastructure are we going to invest in that isn't AI to support Canada, to replace these industries. What does that mean for workforce training? And we need to do more planning, basically. We can't leave it to the market. That's what it comes down to. And we need a strong social safety net. So in Ontario, in all of these conservative provinces across Canada, we're seeing more and more cuts to the social safety net. We're seeing at the federal level, the feds are not transferring as much money to the provinces as they have. So the federal net GDP is steady, but for all of the provinces, their net debt to GDP is growing because they've taken on more of these responsibilities that really matter to people. And then recognizing the geographically concentrated, we need to have just transition policy panels for fossil fuel communities, and it's going to be expensive. It's buying their house, it's finding them a new job, it's investing in some alternative industry there. The Green Economy Network that I'm on the steering committee, I'm just going to plug this, has a plan that would get us to our climate target. It was on that graph that I showed you before. And it's investing in renewable energy, it's investing in energy efficiency. Alberta's housing stock is one of the least efficient in Canada. So you could get a long way to reducing your GHGs just by having the government hire people to go around and you know, insulate people's houses and new windows and all of these things. Front doors are really expensive. I have an old house in Ottawa, and I'm like, oh, I'm an environmentalist. I should replace my front door. And we went and looked, and we're like, oh my God. I can't afford to do that. So I have like towels around it, right? It's absurd. But this is something that we can do and we can all do. And it's especially important for when we're applying a carbon tax that the government take on the work of doing that for low-income households, right? So that then they save their costs, their energy costs aren't going up. Public transit is huge. High-speed rail, people have proposed high-speed rail between Calgary and Alberta, but after Lynn last night said that you guys don't visit each other, maybe we shouldn't. But this is, over 5 years, this would cost $80 billion, which is a lot of money. The Alberta's budget is already around $45, $50 billion a year. But it's doable, because that's all of Canada. That's $80 billion for all of Canada. This would be hiring people to make Canada's a net zero carbon economy. And you can split it between the federal government, the provinces, municipalities. You can expand existing revenue streams to do it. And just remembering that the cost of inaction is astronomical. California, which has privatized their energy grid, PG&E, I thought it was interesting when Lynn last night said how much of the debt was junk or near junk. PG&E, which is one of the energy providers in California, their debt has ballooned because of fires, and they're both fixing it up and their responsibility for fires, and their debt has now been downgraded to almost junk status. And they had to have a government official had to come out and say, no, we don't want PG&E to go bankrupt. And then, because investors were selling it off, they were selling off the stock, and it was looking like it might go bankrupt because of all of this debt that they have already, and that's not even looking into the future, right, what it's going to be. And so climate change is already costing us so much money, and if we don't take action, it's going to cost us astronomically more in the future. And so if those future people could lend us money to solve this problem for them, they do that. People talk about not borrowing money because we don't want to leave this debt on future generations, but we're leaving a different kind of debt for future generations. And they would happily lend us the money to fix it right now if we were willing to do that. So this is what we need. We need 1 million climate jobs, we need a real just transition, and we need industrial transformation. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of industrial transformation because I think that should be at the community level. I think that should be, co-ops. I think that should be whatever makes sense at the regional level, and that the provinces should help enable that kind of industrial transformation. And this gets to the question of, well, what is the role of government in this type of situation? It's essentially to ensure the well-being of the people that they're responsible to, right? And what's their role in the economy? I think, a lot of people think, we should own some natural monopolies that we all rely on: electricity, roads, telephones. Saskatchewan has much cheaper telephone coverage, guys, because it's a Crown corporation. So these are things that make sense to do. Hospitals, schools, shelters. And these are green jobs too, ostensibly, right? This is the type of economy that we want to build. We want to build an economy where we're taking care of each other. But they should also help out even distribution, because we're still in a capitalist economy, and that capitalist economy, that market, does not distribute wealth fairly. We know that. So the government's role is to step in and help even that out. And part of doing that is labor legislation, both increasing unionization, which this government has addressed, especially for lower-end workers. They've made it easier to unionize low-wage sectors, which is critical. And then, again, you hear a lot of people worried about deficit spending and worried about borrowing, but we're taking into account of other costs that aren't in this budget, right? So when you ignore the future cost of the environment, when you ignore the cost of the human cost of income inequality, then you're going to get a screwy account balance sheet. And then they also want to invest in future productivity growth. They want to make sure that we can continue to make stuff and be productive. And so investing in roads, investing in broadband for everyone, investing in education. This is all kind of things that government should be doing, because it doesn't make sense for any other individual to do it. And when they do, it skews income inequality. So these are things that everyone should have access to. And we can afford to do it. I stole this from Nick Falvo on Twitter, posted it from the Alberta Alternative Budget conference that was yesterday. Alberta's debt is growing. Yes, it's growing quickly. In another 2 years, it will probably be up to $10 billion. But it's low compared to the rest of the country, and the need is so important that it's worth it. So that is all I have. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Angela for that. I'm going to resituate this for our height difference. There we go. So, I think that was a really wonderful recap of how many different moving pieces there are when it does come to actively addressing climate change. And it's really clear to see that a climate leadership plan is absolutely essential as we move forward for future generations and also for our own generation. I do have a little bit of context into what Labour has been working on as far as the just transition for coal. I know that Gil McGowan at the AFL and all of the staff there have worked immensely with our coal workers here to change that narrative, as she said, alongside the Notley government in preparing emotionally for what that change is going to look like. And now at a federal level, there is a committee, president of the CLC, Hassan Yousaf, is the co-chair, and Gil McGowan also sits on that. So again, that's going into all of our coal communities across Canada in order to make the change that is inevitably coming, but is still, of course, very emotionally challenging for families. So really thank you for that. And I know that within our own spheres of influence that the carbon tax is an area of contention, but I do really think that it's a piece of the puzzle when it comes to making the revenue that's necessary. We saw a very wonderful pie chart for where the revenue can come from, but the revenue necessary to be able to fund the transition into greener jobs, both within current industries and creating new industries, which I think was beautifully laid out in her little context in your pamphlets with what we can do to prepare for the opportunity of new economies. So thank you so much, Angela. All right, so next up we have Mel McMillan. So Mel is a professor in the Department of Economics and a fellow of the Institute of Public Economics at the University of Alberta. His BA and MSc are from the University of Alberta, and his PhD is from Cornell University. He has been at the University of Alberta since 1975. Mel's research and teaching interests are in public economics, particularly urban and local economics, fiscal federalism, and the demand and supply of public goods and services. He has published in these areas and has advised governments as well as organizations nationally and internationally, including the World Bank. No big deal. Although retired, Mel remains actively involved in academic and policy matters. So please help me in welcoming Mel.
Thank you. Okay, I'm accustomed to walking around when I lecture, so I'm not tied to the mic. Just a few words of introduction. I'm an economist. I'm a facts-based guy. Unlike Janet Brown, who is dealing with perceptions, I like to deal with numbers and evidence and so on. And I have no illusions that the facts I'll present to you today will change anyone's perceptions. I'm enough of a realist to know that. So I've got a heap of slides, and I'm going to go through them quite quickly, but basically the slides are to provide some background for you to study at your leisure, for those of you that are sufficiently number geeked to want to do that kind of thing. But I'm going to use them as kind of backdrops for the story that I'm going to tell you. So what's the story I'm going to tell you? Well, I want to talk about what the Alberta economy is like a little bit. Then we'll talk about Alberta's fiscal future, and we have to look a little bit at the past to understand that. Talk about revenues, expenditures, debt, and some possible fixes to the situation, and then a couple closing thoughts. Okay, Alberta economy. Well, the Alberta economy is facing a dramatic change, or has experienced a dramatic change of pace, and done so after a nasty recession. Basically, it's been boom, bust, and sort of a recovery. And it's a sort of recovery that got Trevor Tombe in trouble because people don't believe you've had a recovery until things are better than what they were before the recession. So, economists define it differently, but okay, what happened? Okay, this is GDP per capita in real dollars, and looking from 2000, most of the data that I have here is from 2000 to the present, and some of it is predicting into the future. So anyway, these are the nominal GDP going up like this. You see the recession that occurred after the global crisis and the recession that we're currently have recently experienced and are now in recovery. We had a 19% drop in nominal GDP. A lot of that was a decline in oil prices, okay? A very large chunk of that. Real output declined 10%. Big changes. These are large changes, and even relative to the global financial crisis, which was similar, the recovery here has come more slowly, and not nearly so much as it was in the earlier recession. So, anyway, high unemployment in the province resulted. So we had, unemployment went way up, and it's on its way down, and it's going to go down further in the future, but it goes down slowly. Useful to also look, in addition to numbers, at the unemployment rate. Here's the latest recession. Unemployment went from about 4.5% to 8%, down to about 7% now. But just to remember, if you go back into the 80s and 90s, we had 15 successive years of unemployment higher than what we're experiencing today. So, this is unpleasant, and it's not nice, and it's bad, but there have been worse periods by far. Total employment, the total labor force in the economy has actually recovered to previous peak levels, but payroll employment has declined and it has not recovered to the previous peak levels. So payroll employees have not got hit harder by the recession and have not seen the full recovery or as much of a recovery. Household primary income, this is on a per capita basis, going up. This is nominal. You saw it took a 8.7% hit as a result of the recession, and it has not recovered to the previous levels. So, okay, why have things gone so badly? You know, basically, it's oil sands investment is less attractive than it was. And this is capital investment in Alberta oil sands and conventional oil and gas. This is the total. It was going up. It dropped to less than half, and it's basically flattened out after a small recovery. The recovery is basically due to conventional oil and gas, and the big drop, a big increase, and the big drop is essentially oil investment in the oil sands. And the oil sands, you know, that is where we got the boom, the construction in that industry, and the bust has also come from there, and we're looking at a kind of uncertain future in terms of oil sand investment. This is another picture about oil and sands investment. Oil and gas capital formation is about halved, and 75% of the decline was from oil sands. However, other investment has been done fairly well and been fairly stable, but it is declining. It's on a slight declining trend. Well, non-residential capital formation, here's Alberta up here. Here are some of the other provinces down here. Saskatchewan, which is actually basically a natural resource-based economy, much like Alberta, but not as dependent as Alberta, is kind of in between Alberta and the other provinces. We have high investments. We have high investments because we have a very large capital stock per capita because of the nature of the oil and gas industry. This is the net non-residential capital stock per capita. Alberta is about $200,000 per capita. Here's Ontario at $50,000. We're 4 times as large, 3 times as large as BC and Manitoba, and Saskatchewan's the only other one that comes close due to its natural resource nature. So where's the Alberta economy going? Well, we're proceeding on with growth, and it's going at a slower but still respectable rate. Here are growth rates in the Alberta economy since 2000, and you can see they were quite high. In the run just before 2015, we were averaging 5.4%, and the forecast now, after a fairly good recovery in 2014, the forecast now is 2.6%, which is dramatically low. I mean, half of what it was here, dramatically low by Alberta standards, but it is still comparable to what it is in other provinces, in fact, better than it is going to be in many provinces. So, slow growth is the future. All this has an effect on the Alberta public finances, and my assessment is that it's a revenue problem. It's mostly a revenue problem. And if you look at Alberta per capita revenue in real dollars from 2000 to 2014, it's, no, sorry, I guess it's 15 actually. It averaged $3,210. It dropped, and the expectation was that it will be about $1,100 per capita from 2015 on. So you're looking at what amounts to a $2,100 or a 17.6% drop in revenue to the province. So dramatic change in revenue. And now that wasn't, these are what the real prices, how they change. And there's the expectation that revenues are going to increase towards 2024, 22, 23, 24. Those are often considered optimistic by some, but even if they do materialize, you only get back to about 37% of where we were. That is when we were back in this range here. So the expectations are not very good for resource revenues improving the pictures. What about expenditures? Put Alberta's expenditures in perspective. This is per capita real dollars, 2016 dollars. You can see that there was a substantial run-up in expenditures per capita up until the global financial crisis. Since then, those have been growing at, well, have not been growing. They've been essentially $12,000 per capita for a decade. Okay, so expenditures, real expenditures per capita, have been meeting inflation plus population growth, which is a standard criteria for the more right-wing perspective on what government should do. However, it's also interesting to look at government's expenditures in another way. This way, we're looking at it in terms of expenditures relative to the 10-province average. Well, since 2000, our expenditures have been essentially the average expenditure by a province in Canada on a per capita basis. So we're basically an average spending province. And another way of looking at it is to look at it as what is it as a government expenditure as a percentage of provincial income or the economy. And I use household expenditure as an index or a measure of the size of the Alberta economy. And I can go into some reasons why I do that, but I won't here, or at this time anyway. We have, since 2000, we have gone along, floated along at about an average of 21.7%. That is, government expenditures, program expenditures, have been averaged 21.7% of what total household income has been in the economy. Been flat, been steady over boom, bust, couple recessions, etc. So very stable. And when you compare that to what it is in other provinces, here is Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. And so you find that we're spending the same percentage of our household income on provincial government as other provinces, Ontario and BC. I mention Ontario and BC specifically because those are low expenditure provinces, okay? Other provinces are spending 25 to 30% per capita, or of their household income. And part of the reason, as I said, BC and Ontario are low spending provinces. They spend about $9,700 per capita versus we're spending about $12,400 per capita. And but our household income is much higher in Alberta. So as a result of that, our expenditures relative to household income are lower. So here's Alberta's per household income and per capita, which has been much higher. And the interesting thing to note is that we're forecasting, or these forecasts come from the Conference Board of Canada, forecasting those to continue to be substantially higher, not quite as high as they were, but still substantially higher, like 15% higher than BC and Ontario. So we're a high income province. But Alberta has a problem. It's got deficits and it's got growing debt. So what are we going to do about that? Well, here's the problem. Okay, there's the expenditures per capita, the expenditures per capita going along here. Here go the revenues, come along 2015 and 16 and 17. We have a big drop in revenues. Those are expected to continue, or that low revenues continue, gradually improving. But what is happening is that the provincial government sees that according to the provincial government plan, we will balance the budget again in 2023-24. So, but in the meantime, we're running deficits and we're accumulating debt. And so here's 2009, and we didn't have hardly any debt at the time, but it was growing throughout this period. And then we, whoops, excuse me. I'm back on? Okay. So here we are currently, and that debt is expected to expand and peak out at about 2024. And this is net assets. This is financial assets of the province, less debt owed. That's been going down over this entire period of time. So we have growing debt. And this is not something that has not happened before. Here's where we're forecast to be in 2023, 24, in that range. It's peaking out at about 150% of government revenues. That is, the provincial government debt would be 150% of government revenues. Well, that's the level that we experienced in the mid-90s right here, just prior to Mr. Klein coming into office. So in the mid-80s, debt grew quickly. From about 40% of provincial government revenues to 150% decline during the Klein years, and then and later to almost nothing, and then they've been growing, and they've been growing ever since. And the net assets have been just in the opposite direction, almost a mirror image. Okay, but we've been here before. We've seen high debt levels relative to government revenues. This is government debt relative to as a percentage of GDP and as a percentage of government revenue. I'm going to ignore the percentage of GDP. I think it's a bad measure when you're looking at Alberta compared to other provinces, that is. And the red lines are as a percentage of government revenue. This is where we expect to be in the end, towards the end of the provincial government's plan to balance. That is, when we're at about 150% of revenue. When it would have been here, so it becomes about 75, and then drops down to about 80%. Only 2 provinces currently have a level of debt below what Alberta would experience by the time we get our finances in control, our budget balanced according to the government plan. So this debt is manageable when you look at it and compare it to that in other provinces. Here's Ontario and Quebec, you know. So debt is unpleasant. It's probably unnecessary to have been in this bad of a situation, but we can deal with it. Okay, how did we get into this situation? Well, essentially the problem is that we treated some permanent changes in natural resource prices as if they were a temporary problem and dealt with them as a stabilization issue rather than a structural issue. And what I do here is take that earlier graph that I showed you, and I break it down into pre the global financial crisis, pre-2008, where we were getting $3,726 per capita on average of resource revenues. And then I look at the first break, which was after the global financial crisis. Natural resources prices plummeted, and they have not recovered. And there's no expectation of them recovering. Okay, but During this period of time, what happened? Well, the provincial government ran down its sustainability fund in order to cover deficits and to finance capital, and it also borrowed money to finance capital. Okay? It treated it as a stabilization problem rather than a structural permanent change problem. Then we come to the drop in oil prices where we get another hit, and we're basically treating this much the same way. We're looking at it as, you know, we're going to hold on here and we're going to hope that in the long run, well, we're actually going to plan to take some action to ride it out and debt will increase, hoping for some increase in natural resource prices in the distant future, but these are still going to be small. We have to deal with a problem that is structural and not just stabilization. So how might we fix? Well, some people talk about cutting expenditures. Well, if you want to cut your expenditures today to balance the budget, you're talking at something in the 15 to 20% range, actually closer to 20%, but say it's 15 to 20%. Well, 15% of the budget goes here is your school system, okay? So if you want to cut 20%, which I've heard some people, rumors that they want to cut out of the budget in order to balance it, so, because you're going to cut, well, they don't say cut expenditures, you're not going to cut core services, you're going to reduce you're going to restore the 10% tax, you're going to reduce the corporate income tax, and you're going to get rid of the carbon tax. So you've got quite a bundle of things there that you have to deal with that are going to make your problem more difficult. So here you are, do you just eliminate the school system? It's going to hit core services somewhere. Here's your health, here's your school system, here's your advanced education, here's your social services, and then there's other things. So where are you going to get your 15 or 20%? Tell us that. Okay, this is a difficult question. So the magnitude of the issue is quite important. Okay, this is the provincial government's, the NDP government's plan to balance. Here we are in 2017-18, right here. We're essentially at the 21.7% level of spending relative to household incomes, okay? The provincial government plans to gradually reduce that so that in 2023-24, this percentage is down to 18.9%, okay? So this is a new low. And just to show, when Mr. Klein came in and cut expenditures in Alberta, he took it down to 19%. So 18.9, 19%. So expect it to hurt just about the same as what Mr. Klein's cuts did in the early 90s. Some of us are old enough to remember. Fair number of us in this room are old enough to remember. Now, the other thing here is that if you go to talking about a 20% cut, they're talking about knocking this percentage down to 17.4%. Now, we haven't seen levels of that, expenditure levels by government that have been that low. We have not witnessed that. So just to keep that in perspective in mind. So will Albertans be prepared to take reductions even of the magnitude that the NDP government is talking about? Well, that's hard to say. We have to remember that Alberta is the highest income province. It is also a province that faces high costs. We have high incomes, but that means that our teachers cost us more, our nurses and doctors cost us more. If you want a plumber to work on a infrastructure building, a hospital, a school, if you want contractors to work on roadways, etc., these people cost you more than what they do in other provinces. So we're in high cost, somewhat high cost. And those higher costs are continuing. They're they've abated a bit. And then the other thing is that we're also the lowest taxed province, as we've often told. So fortunately, we have some room to maneuver. Albertans get the average expenditures with the lowest taxes. We pay 72% of the taxes compared to the average province, we pay taxes that are 72% of that average. Only two other provinces, BC and Saskatchewan, pay taxes that are less than average, and we're well below them. Okay. Here's the the low taxes in Alberta give us the Alberta tax advantage, and what these amounts are the billions of dollars of additional taxes that Albertans would pay if we had imposed on Albertans the tax systems in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario. So if you had the British Columbia tax system in Alberta, you would pay $11.4 billion more than what you Albertans would pay collectively, $11.4 billion more than what they do today. And if we had the Newfoundland Labrador system, it would be roughly almost $22 billion more. So we have a great tax advantage. It's interesting to compare that tax advantage with the deficit. This is the current deficit, about $8.8 billion, maybe bigger with the Canadian Select price the way that it is, but eventually. But this is the expected deficit this year. Essentially, we could, Albertans could collect additional $8.8 billion and still have a $2.4 billion tax advantage relative to the next lowest tax province, which is BC. And we would have even larger tax advantages with respect to all the other provinces. So conceptually, you could have a tax increase that would eliminate our deficit and still leave Albertans with a tax advantage. And if you wanted to maintain the level of services that we have at 21.7%, the average that we've experienced for the last 18 years approximately, if you wanted to maintain that, we estimate that you could probably do that with an additional tax of $4 to $6 billion, okay? Which is about what you could expect from a sales tax comparable to sales taxes in most other provinces. Closing thoughts. Alberta government is becoming more costly. That is, we don't have the natural resource revenues that we used to have that subsidized services to Albertans. So if we want those services, we're going to have to pay more. So government is becoming more costly. And so in that situation, we have options. What will Albertans choose? Will they go for just cuts, just taxes, or some mix of the two? And of course, part of the question is, what will they do in the short run, and also what will they do in the long run? Because part of this may be, you have to show me how bad it hurts before I'm going to give you any additional tax revenue. And so they may want to experience the suffering, just as we did in the Klein years. The Klein years, took it down to 19%, and then 2 years later, it was 23%. Or do we hold out and hope for another energy boom? Which, who knows? Who knows? But even if it were to occur, I think this would be a great opportunity for Albertans to reset their fiscal strategy. So, thank you very much.
All right, so thank you so much for that discussion, and I'm going to jump right into questions here. We did start a little late. We were going through some technical issues, so if folks don't mind waiting for a couple minutes after 11:45, that would be great, but open to you. So we do have a microphone coming around. Does anyone have any questions? And I'll ask Angela to come back up here as well, please. Oh.
There. That's the way to say stuff, no? Yeah.
Okay, over there.
I was going to slip out the door.
Yes.
There you go, Angela.
Hey, I'm Joel with Public Interest Alberta. Thank you both for your presentations. My question was for Angela. You said that if you had your chance to give advice to Minister Ceci, that you would recommend changes to personal income tax and corporate tax. And I'm wondering if you have a specific proposal for what those changes would look like and how much revenue they would raise.
You're really tall. So actually, some progressive economists did meet with Joe Ceci shortly after they were elected. And we made several recommendations around what revenue could be made. I think, isn't there somebody in Alberta that already does that? Just if you had the same progressive income taxes as, say, even Saskatchewan, how much money that could raise. So that's definitely out there. I don't have it off the top of my head yet.
Quick question with a supplemental. You listed the greenhouse gas emissions that were projected. Was that treating methane as though it is 25 times as warming as carbon dioxide over 100 years, or 86 over 20, which is very important considering we're hitting natural feedbacks much sooner than 100 years?
No idea. I would have to ask Marnie,
Okay.
who made that graph for us.
Assuming it is the 86, it's worth noting that natural gas, even with the regulatory reductions the Notley government is seeking, will still accelerate global warming 2 to 4 times as fast as any coal generation it replaces. Why are we focusing on coal generation and not methane mitigation?
No, I agree. And that's why I said what Alberta is doing is replacing coal with natural gas, which isn't the way to go.
It's worse.
Yeah, it's actually worse. Okay,
Greenwashing climate change.
there you go.
Sorry, just right here.
A climate change program that would involve spending $80 billion over 5 years. Now, is this money supposed to be just coming from the province, or do we hope to have some federal input? And if we do have federal money, what we saw under Stephen Harper, anytime there was any suggestion that money be given to the provinces, it had to involve a private-public partnership, the big corporate boondoggle. And I was just wondering, is there any indication that under Trudeau things will be different, or is this just going to become another cash grab for the big corporations?
So that's a great point. So that $80 billion was for all of Canada, 50% coming from the feds, 40% from the provinces, and the rest from municipalities. And what we've seen Trudeau doing is trying to use the infrastructure bank to invest in public-private partnerships. We've seen this in Montreal with the public transit and other things. So in terms of privatization and investment in infrastructure, that's definitely happening, and that's part of Trudeau's plan. That's not part of the Green Economy Network's plan, obviously, but it's something you have to watch out for.
Bob asked, I wonder, Angela and Mel too, whether there really is much evidence on the gain to the province on raising the personal income tax rates, making it progressive, what the actual experience has been. And I mean, especially given that we've been through a recession and corporations are not profitable. And I guess the other problem for progressives is how do you keep those high income earners in the province, to pay the taxes? And last night we had the presentation about the trillions in offshore money.
So this is always a threat. People are like, oh, we'll just leave and go somewhere else, except that if you are, say, that high income person that is going to threaten to leave, you're going to be taxed more in BC or Saskatchewan. So you're still better off to stay here. You might try to hide your money in the tax havens. People would be surprised to know, like, farmers in Rosetown have assets in tax havens. So it's not just a big corporation thing. So you have to put the money into enforcement of tax avoidance and evasion if you're going to raise personal income taxes and corporate taxes.
When the higher income taxes came in Alberta, I was back in the days when I was still supervising students. I had a student look at what seemed to be happening. And what appeared to be happening is that, first of all, there was a significant movement from shifting of taxes or forward a year, or income forward a year, so that they could get it taxed at the 10% rate rather than the higher rates that were following the subsequent years. It's really difficult to sort out what, with the decline in the economy, which hits a lot of higher income people, particularly business people. So it's very difficult to sort out. But there's evidence of this shifting that is quite clear, not only what limited little bit of work we did, but in other areas as well. On the corporate side, the provincial government raised the corporate tax, so it was no longer the lowest in the country, provincial tax in the country, to where it was actually somewhat higher than the minimum. I think they've made an error in that, because any national corporation or international corporation has a fair amount of flexibility in terms of shifting revenues or net income from one province to another or one country to another. And it's pretty clear that national corporations do shift income based upon their provincial tax rates.
Thanks so much for your presentations. I am wondering about, so you talked about, Angela, you talked about an industrial strategy, and we also talked about maybe crown corporations and what can we do. So I'm wondering if there's a way to add sort of a gendered lens to those things, because we know a lot of corporations and industry are sponsoring programs where they train women and they're making it all about women, and how can we close the gender pay gap, and that's very industry driven, but it's also in a lot of things like oil and gas. So when we're building these alternatives, how can we ensure that those alternatives are meeting the needs of women and other folks as well, but how can we sort of, I don't know, talk about that or think about that?
Yeah, that would require its whole own workshop, right? Because before I was an economist, I was in the Naval Reserves. And so I have a fair amount of experience being a woman in a male-dominated sector, and you can't just try to recruit more women because the nature of the job itself is so gendered. The expectations of the job are that you don't have to be home to pick up the kids from school, and that you can leave for weeks at a time, and all of these sorts of things. My sister in Saskatchewan is actually a safety inspector, and she's tiny, right? And so she'd walk onto these sites, and there's these big guys, and she'd have to walk through male washrooms in order to get to, like, maybe there was a female washroom there. So the industries that we're talking about are actually so hostile to women, and they're so hostile to families. So that even if we wanted to, say, have like nice jobs for men where they could be there to see their kids, school play or sports team or whatever, these types of industries aren't friendly to that. So it requires a lot of work. But then also, if you take a gendered lens at climate change, I sort of alluded to this. I'm like, healthcare, education, caring professions, caring work, that's something that we need. That's something that we can't outsource to another country. It can't move somewhere else. And And those can be really healthy jobs to focus on and talk about the green economy. It's not just these male jobs, right? And when we see governments talk about investing in infrastructure, it's male jobs that they're talking about, right? They're not talking about the social infrastructure. They're not talking about teachers and nurses and hospitals and all of those things. So it is important to have that gendered lens when you're doing your alternative budget.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up for lunch, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to find the speakers. But first off, please help me in thanking our speakers for coming to see us today.